This is Sirens, a not-so-new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths, if we are able to find the tab where we make the plan to lure the man to the deaths, because we both have too many tabs open. I'm Loren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Radha and
and we are here recording on Wednesday night this week. Like, it feels a little risky to be recording at all, because anytime I turn on the news, like, wait, are we sending ground troops, like a lot of ground troops into the Middle East right now, or any number of other things that have happened? So, like, we're going to try to do our best to raise some issues that are going on in this moment that have struck our fancy. If by the time this episode is released, aliens have invaded, and I have an aside on that, we'll come back to you later. But first, I want to start with our question of the week, as always. On Sirens, we love, or I say we, the royal we, certainly I love a backronym. Love a backronym. And there are so many good ones in the world, but in trying to decide which one was my best, I was like looking up, like, is there a kind of history here? Is there kind of interesting? And I discovered actually something even more delightful than a really good backronym. Well, actually, it is a good backronym. It is the acronym ACT by Representative Mike Honda, which is the accountability and congressional responsibility on naming your motions.
Oh my God.
I know, isn't it great? And it's
Lord.
A bill that would have basically banned this practice of adding words to bills just to create an acronym. And I love that. Like, that, it makes me really happy that he made the effort to go down that path. Like, that's just great. But like, if I was being serious, like, I always love JIADO because it's like an acronym within. It's not actually a backronym, but it's an acronym within an acronym, which I also like. I don't know if that has a word too, but I particularly appreciate that. What about you, Radha?
It's like a Russian nesting dolls acronym. So first of all, many things on this. One is I love a backronym myself and believe that when naming something, you should start with the words you want and then make it work. So in fact, when I was at DoD and was the chief digital and AI officer, our signature initiative was Open Dagger, which I had the letters on the board for and spent some days coming up with the words to backfill it. And I want to know from members of Congress or staff who are there, is this what you do? Because it took me some time, and I just now I guess maybe you could use AI for it. Anyway, that's piece one. Piece two is to say, when I was thinking about this, all of the backronyms I came up with were all like kind of depressing. I'm like, Amber Alert is an acronym.
Oh, it is? I didn't know that.
It's like American Missing Person, something like, it's a backronym. MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Seasonal Affective Disorder. These are all backronyms.
I did not realize, I guess I kind of know, but I hadn't really internalized that the DREAM Act, that's a backronym. Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, which I feel like alien minors, I'm going to get to aliens in a minute. That just, I appreciate what they did there, but come on. The CARE Act.
Yes. But there were missed opportunities. I feel like the Chips and Sciences Act, come on, God. You couldn't come up with some letters that were Chips and Salsa Act.
Oh my gosh.
I feel like they put
chips
the chips and salt.
The chips and, I don't know, defense industrial planning, that would have worked fine. I just want Congress to know we're disappointed in you. And any staffers listening, you can do better. Or just call us, because we
believe in you.
We believe in you. We can totally do this. All right, so I'm going to start with this drill. I've already hinted at two things around aliens. I don't really have anything to say on this particular thing. It's new, except for the fact that in the last, what time is it today? 12 hours, I have learned that EOP, the Executive Office of the President, has registered two new websites, and they are alien.gov and aliens.gov. So I don't know.
Do you have a Google alert out on this? Because I love this idea of Google alerts.
I don't. It's a Blue Sky account. It tells. So this is amazing. I love this. So it tells you when a new government web address is registered or when it's taken offline. And they're I don't know, some 30,000 domains in the U.S. government. It's something ridiculous. And NASA has, I think, 12,000 of them. Because anytime NASA starts a project, they're go to the moon.gov or whatever else it is. But we just registered alien and aliens. And if I don't know, if I'm the president, I'm thinking this war thing doesn't really seem to be going as great. Straits of Hormuz. Can I announce aliens? What a great idea. maybe not a great idea.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't think you were going with aliens in the extraterrestrial sense. I thought we were going to be talking about aliens like people from other countries. And so mine is vaguely related in that it's the SAVE Act, which is also a acronym. Save America Act.
Right, it is the acronym.
Yeah. And so like for folks following along, this requires documentary proof of citizenship, like a passport or a birth certificate to register to vote. And there was a period of time where Trump was like, Republicans are going to do bad in the midterms unless we do this. And I'll just note, this is all related to this theory of the case that is that there are all these non-citizens and voter fraud when there's like negative evidence of this. And I think a lot of the concern of it comes from people when they look at maps and see large swaths of land that are red, forgetting that the land doesn't vote and it's the number of people there that matters. But what I think is particularly galling about this is that the people it impacts are like people who change their name after being married. And as someone who has dealt with the pain in the behind that is changing her name after getting married, in which over a decade later, my one of my bank accounts still does not have my married name because I just can't get it done. I just feel like this is definitely a thing that's going to be a pain, which seems really inconsistent with the MAGA trad wife general trend here. And I'm pretty sure that more Democrats than Republicans actually have passports. So the whole thing seems like not a great idea and quite a pain in the butt.
On the just brief aside on the name changing thing, had mostly planned on changing my name as I wasn't like fully in, fully out, and was basically bullied by my Pentagon office at the time into doing so. Not by like my coworkers, but by the administrative staff who contacted me immediately after my wedding. You're like, okay, here's how your name change material is. Like, and they kept saying over and over again, aren't you going to turn this in? I'm like, oh, I get it. They changed my email address without asking me, which is such a Pentagon move.
Yeah.
The other version of this, like I think the most amount of pain I've had to go through post name change was getting my frequent flyer miles from Delta to go over from my maiden name to my married name. Like, why was that necessary? Like, I feel like can't I just attest to this?
Honestly, my Amtrak account is still in my maiden name. It just is what it is.
It's just, you are riding single on the Amtrak.
That's right.
All right. We have something we'd like to discuss on the Straits of Hormuz. Before I allow Radha to go fully down this path, I want to have a brief serious aside on this.
Fine.
Because I will just attest that this is my fault because I was fully trying to think of like the rom-com analogies here because there's an abundance of them and we just went deep. All right. So Straits of Hormuz. Let's pretend for a moment as though none of us can look at a map or have ever, like, I don't know, read about any sort of war planning for Iran or heard about Millennium Challenge, which was like a big thing for a while. Like, just like pretend that for a minute, because that's apparently what the administration did when they significantly underestimated Iran's willingness to close, or they underestimated their willingness to close the Straits of Hormuz. And they basically just thought that like they would kind of give in and not do this at all, or not put any ships at risk, or not make any threats or anything above. And like, I'm having a hard time even like forming words about this because it is so absolutely baffling. There's a quote there's been in a couple of these news stories of a dude saying, "I am dumbfounded," great word, planning to prevent this exact scenario has been a bedrock principle, and I will vouch for that, of U.S. national security policy for decades. Like, there are shelves, there are dusty books on the second floor of the Pentagon. There are less dusty books on the third floor of the Pentagon. There are files. I'm positive that literally dozens and dozens of dozens of things have been used to prepare for this possible scenario with all kinds of different sorts of contingencies. And on top of that, even if you, for whatever reason, didn't want to talk to the Pentagon, you could just go across the parking lot to Rand and say, like, hey, Rand, have you guys thought about this? And I'm like, OMG, this is so my jam. They'd be so excited. Because here's the thing, it's kind of a big deal. Because the Strait has like 27% of the world's maritime crude like goes through it. 9 million barrels a day. That's kind of a lot. A whole bunch of the world's supply can only exit the Gulf through the Strait and has no alternative route. It's just there. This is like the big known thing for a really, really long time. And despite this, our good friend Secretary Hegseth, despite being like totally overwhelmed by this, very clearly, says that it's patently ridiculous that they had underestimated this. I'm like, dudes, you definitely are idiots, or you underestimated it, or something. The other piece of this that I really love here is our allies, because apparently we decided to go out and say, hey, you guys are gonna like help us open the strait again, and we're gonna be like besties, and we're gonna like take all this cool risks together doing like maritime stuff together, right? And this is, fairly recently after we've called them all a whole lot of bad names for a really, really long period of time, and we are being like the worst possible version of this boyfriend, assuming that the desperate girl, the allies, will come back and say, I totally want to help you again and help you open the strait. And all of the allies have come back in the best possible forms of, yeah, I'm really not interested in this. You're just going to have to go like lay in your own shit for a while. So I'm going to stop there.
And no. Don't forget that to try to alleviate this, we've had to remove our sanctions on Russia. Temporary. You may remember Russia, the unprovoked invasion of this European country, Ukraine, and we put a bunch of sanctions on. Yeah. So
I had just kind of opened my brain to the possibility of this is probably like a Hugh Grant film of some kind, kind of made a note of it. And then Radha apparently had some spare time, and I will turn it over to her to explain what is going on.
I'd like to preface this by saying that I was in the Austin airport with 10,000 of my closest friends, where I had many hours because I was concerned about the TSA lines. And so when Loren suggested this, I was thinking about what it is. And then it occurred to me that it is the movie He's Just Not That Into You, but national security crisis.
Right, which it should have been to begin with, but here we are now.
And the key is that Iran is, in fact, with the Strait of Hormuz, like the guy that she wants, but is just not that available and has been sending mixed signals. And there's all this will he, won't he negotiate in good faith? Will he, won't he take ballistic missiles off the table? I mean, maybe the movie's a little bit different, but basically Trump is Gigi, who, if you've seen the movie, is the Jennifer Goodwin character. And he is absolutely convinced that despite all of these people who've done all of these things, he is the exception. And he kind of likes the drama. He wants to pay his bills late. He likes to sit by the phone and wait for them to call. And he feels like all of these other people have given in, but now he's the exception, and he launched this war. And then once you go down there, you've got Trump feeling like he's the exception. You've got this war going on. Iran behaving basically exactly the way they have been predicted to behave, in fairness, fully consistently with all of the other predictions. You've got Europe, who is basically the Drew Barrymore character, who is getting mixed signals from everyone and is like, why can't I just get a consistent partner to go out with me like a normal person? And instead, you're like, you didn't, and I swear this is a real quote from Berlin, in which they're like, it's like you didn't even consult us before the date. You told us you didn't need us, and now you want us to pay for dinner. So
thank you, Berlin, for giving us that amazing quote. You did exactly what we've always wanted.
I feel like they're so done. And the last thing I'll just say is China is the Justin Long character, Alex, who's basically like, we know the deal. We know the games. We know how to talk. They went to Iran. They talked through it. Apparently, no press conferences. They negotiated private safe passage, and they're just moving along with their party. So I more or less feel like we've fallen into this trap, and the solution is to recognize you're not the exception, you're the rule, and figure out how to follow it from there.
Or announce that there's aliens and just hope that people get distracted in some way.
I mean, there you go.
I mean, I just love
Dealer's
that.
choice.
We have now made Iran effectively the most powerful country in the world. It's kind of amazing, actually. Congratulations, everybody. This is exactly what I'm sure you thought of at the beginning of this as you were making your Call of Duty videos. Well, Iran, there's 70 million things that we could talk about on Iran. We will probably continue, unfortunately, to have to do so for the near future, given that my favorite thing today was we don't have boots on the ground, on this island. We're not planning to do boots on the ground because like islands are not like land. They're not like ground. It's just like fake ground. Like, okay, great, sure, no boats in the ground. That'll be fine. So let's move on to dumpster fires. This is when I selected this dumpster fire, it became like less relevant, then more relevant, then less relevant, then even more relevant again. It is definitely this is both a big thing that happened, things that continue to change overall in terms of how the Trump administration is managing its U.S. institutions, and also like the impact that we see it having on this exact historical moment. And that is on Voice of America. So I will turn it over to Radha.
Yeah. So last week, a Reagan-appointed federal judge ruled that basically the Trump administration could not disband Voice of America. And it was a pretty remarkable ruling, given everything that's happened. So for those who aren't tracking, Voice of America has been around since the 1940s. It has now outlasted the Nazis and the Soviet and every administration that has tried to meddle with it. And it's worth noting that the ruling came out on the same day that the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, who has been the subject of a number of controversies for leveraging his platform for what many perceive as political bias, threatened to take away the broadcast license of any news organizations covering the war in ways that the administration didn't like. Trump has called the Voice of America corrupt and highly unpatriotic. And so it's a very bimodal system, I'll call it right now, where,
Yeah.
or highly consistent system, depending, I guess, on your perspective, where the government was basically ordered by its, I'll note, co-equal branch of government to maintain this independent broadcasting while threatening to punish this independent sort of free press. So maybe let's start with Loren. Can you walk us through, like, why does the Voice of America exist? Why its independence? What is the value of it as a strategic asset as compared to general broadcasts?
Yeah. So, I mean, Voice America is interesting because like most American audiences only sort of tangentially know about it. They have heard the REM song Radio Free Europe. They may have experienced references to it in movies or media, but Voice America effectively is not for us as an audience. So it's like the getting championship for it is challenging. So it's little bits of history here, and some of this I will just fully admit is like VOA propaganda because they are storytellers and good at telling your story. Is that they began broadcasting in the 1940s. Shortly after, a little bit after Pearl Harbor. Their kind of tagline was the news may be bad or good, we shall tell you the truth. And the logic here was that the U.S. could attempt to win the information war because it was being a source of information, source of truth, including saying not great things about America, that wasn't like a goal, which is what distinguished it from state propaganda that it was up against, particularly during World War II. You've probably heard different versions of Radio Berlin and Radio Tokyo doing their own sorts of propaganda, particularly for service members deployed overseas. So by the end of World War II, it had a few thousand programs in many, many languages. And during the Cold War, it was a really important information lifeline for many, particularly those who were behind the Iron Curtain. As an example, in another part of the world, at and after Tiananmen Square in late 80s, Voice of America had reportedly millions of Chinese listeners that were paying attention to what was going on via that broadcast because they didn't have local media that they could trust in this space. It broadcasts the I Have a Dream speech live to a global audience. And Neil Armstrong likewise had a global audience for his first steps on the moon for Voice of America listeners. So again, and this is a great Voice of America propaganda line, but true. Why, like, authoritarian governments spent decades and billions of dollars trying to jam the signal of Voice of America and its different programs and tried to make it illegal to listen to. It imprisoned some of its reporters and really tried to prevent people from accessing this. So I think a relevant question was, why would they do that if it wasn't working? And they like most likely wouldn't have bothered. And so to kind of step back a little bit from my own propaganda frame, that propaganda, Voice of America was very purposely trying not to be propaganda. It was trying to be reliable, trustworthy, like not having that sort of bias, because the belief was that propaganda that looks like it doesn't work. And Voice of America worked really hard, at least it did for a long period of time, to try not to look like that.
We've talked about it in a number of different hot and cold wars, I'll say, in the past, or hot and cold incidents in the past, from the Cold War to Tiananmen Square. We just mentioned the Strait of Hormuz and question mark, boots on the ground, exclamation point. So, before the current conflict, there were millions, I think over 6 million Iranians listening to Radio Farda every week for news that was outside of the Iranian state media. This is a major conflict, and for the first time, Voice of America is not in functional existence in the same way. What does that mean? What is what is the impact of that? Why does that matter?
So just to step back for a second, so last year when the head of Voice of America, or the head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, I can't remember what the GM stands for, basically put everybody at Voice of America and elsewhere on administrative leave. It canceled a ton of contracts for distribution, as well as with wire services. One of the big things at the time that got a ton of attention, because it was, if not immediately reversed and shortly thereafter, tried to kind of reverse it, was ending lots of different elements of the Persian language service, Radio Farda. We used to be a full day of broadcasting, that it went back to 45 minutes a day. And then there's been a couple of different efforts to pull back in furloughed staffers when this most recent conflict started, but also I think in the last year or so, there's been other instances I realized, I'm oh wait, actually the president is literally talking about doing Voice of America's mission. We should maybe have some sort of resource in order to talk to the Iranian people here. So this is what's going on at this moment, even before the U.S. intervention here, which I don't want to undersell at all, but even before that, we were experiencing significant political change going on in Iran. And the not having a Voice of America presence there at a point in time where it was really challenging for many Iranians to get information was a big deal. It was still there's still elements that were operating very much under a ton of both resource and administrative pressure. The Radio Farda has been covering the war. It's had a lot of its staff furloughed. It has been having to rent transmission equipment because the administration blocked it from using its own. The staff has been called in and back and forth to jobs when bombs started falling, and they are basically on a regular basis waiting to figure out, do I still have a job? Am I still getting paid? It's just unimaginable circumstances for anybody, but in particular in this instance where the value to me would be obvious of why you would want to be able to have information access here, but apparently not necessarily to the administration. But even with that, it's still kept up a pretty trusted following. Has millions of video views on Instagram. Has a big spike of folks who were trying to get access to this because Iranians have, because of their limited media access, they really, really want the services it's providing here. And so what it's been trying to do during that time period is pretty typical for this sort of fare of debunking the state media in real time when it's able to. The regime has actually, as a result of that, been pressuring the families of some of the staff members inside Iran to get some of the broadcast stopped. So it matters a great deal to what's going on in this space. And so it's clear. What's funny to me is the administration seems to know that this is important, maybe is embarrassed by the fact that they went to all these lengths to destroy this a few times, not just once, but a few times, is trying to figure out how to do this gracefully, but also frankly just doesn't know what they're doing overall. During a major, not just the protest, but the major conflict right now, does not have good, reliable access to, hasn't invested in good, reliable access the Iranian people, because it did all of this stupid shit at the beginning of the administration.
We should come back to this question of Voice of America and what is the real argument for it, and why can't we rely on independent media to do some of this? But before we do that, I mean, the good news, I guess, is a federal judge has said, no, you can't just fire all these people at Voice America and you got to get it back together. But in a world where government capacity is not a like 0-1, like turn it off, turn it on, and it all reappears, what does the ruling mean in terms of what happened? You mentioned a lot of cut contracts. Like, what is recoverable and what isn't in this space?
Yeah, I mean, this is true for any place where the federal government has either furloughed employees, laid them off, tried to close an organization. Like, in any one of those circumstances, imagine that you are told you're losing your job and you know that there's like a legal fight about it. It's possible you might wait around and try to see, can I get this job back? But it's also very possible that you're going to need to, for any number of reasons, move on with your life. So that's just like on a personal, individual basis. But these are things like actual equipment that has either been sold, is no longer being rented or given away or not utilized. Contracts with wire services like AP and Reuters and AFP, these were canceled. You can put those back online, but those aren't immediate. And that's not something that, frankly, government is terribly good at just like doing overall. Some of the relationships with affiliates that are overseas on radio and TV, those relationships were terminated. So rebuilding those was not something that we just were able to do easily like that. There's a whole lot of risk associated with some of those platforms and working with Voice of America. So having canceled it, they are probably well within their rights to say, do I actually want to turn this back on or not? What is the risk associated for me here? There's also, frankly, like been just a tremendous morale and risk problem that there's not anything that a judge can do anything about. Just as all these things are happening, the ruling came after a prominent Iranian dissident and Voice of America journalist had been fired in what he alleged was an effort to limit his coverage of Reza Pahlavi. The Voice of America White House bureau chief, whose lawsuit drove the ruling, said that the harder fight now is ensuring the newsroom returns to journalism rather than propaganda, which is what they felt worried about risking getting pushed to. And she thinks that it's going to be more difficult. That's going to be as difficult or more, if not more difficult than the fight that they've been having so far. So, I mean, the judge, like, since they did the initial piece, said, like, you've got to be able to bring back 1,000 folks next week. And, like, that is, I mean, as somebody who's worked in federal HR and operations, never mind, like, just, like, the desire to do so, that's just administratively challenging to do. So turning this on and off is not something you can just do overall. But then in addition to all the things I just mentioned, I think there's a valid listenership and trust relationship that goes with that too. Going from fairly limited programming overseas to larger will not necessarily carry what it did 2 years ago.
Yeah. So let me shift gears for a second, and then I want to tie the two pieces back together. But while this Voice of America shenanigans were happening, there's also the FCC chair threatening to pull the broadcast licenses of any news organizations covering the Iran war in ways that were not, air quotes, patriotic. This is, I think, not totally new for Brendan Carr in terms of threats and responses. There have been a variety of incidents, in particular targeting late night. But so what's happening? What's happening on the, air quotes, independent broadcast side of the house here?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things we're saying here. One is there are likely many intentions for Carr and the Trump statements here. A really big one was just threat and fear. And not just threat and fear about the licenses themselves, which are not really even things that come up for renewal unless they do go out of sequence in some way and do things that are sort of extra illegal, which would not be terribly surprising this administration. But there's a lot of things going on right now that folks are probably aware of separately that are very much implicate the broadcasters in terms of the mergers that they're trying to pursue and the business deals they're trying to pursue between various outlets and that will pretty significantly reshape coverage. And the Trump administration has made no bones about the fact that they're trying to influence and shape a lot of those outcomes in terms of content. So these sorts of threats that are coming up are likely, or at least meant to play in executives' minds of like, oh, well, I'm not going to get the deal that I wanted in terms of regulatory relief if the Trump administration is saying that my coverage is bad. That's That is likely in one of the intents here, though who knows, like in terms of like the day-to-day. But this is not, I mean, this is by no means the first source of threat that we've heard about this, where people may remember Jimmy Kimmel, that Carr suggested that local stations would risk their licenses over some of Jimmy Kimmel's comments. And his show ended up being pulled temporarily and then reinstated. Stephen Colbert is going off the air, and he has been told that he couldn't air an interview with a congressman out of concern that it would trigger an FCC retaliation. The threats that the Trump administration has made are probably, they are real enough because the Trump administration doesn't necessarily care about law and process, but they're not necessarily meant to be like a real threat. They're meant to be hey, there's all kinds of other things that I can use to make you care, and I'm absolutely going to use them. So we have Voice of America, where they're trying to silence information overseas. You have FCC actions where you're trying to influence coverage here in the US. And it's both ironic this is happening at the same time, given what some of the outcomes are, at least in legal review. But the approach that they're taking here is basically we want to control the information environment, particularly during a war, but also full stop, period.
So maybe just bringing us full circle here, there are obviously some legitimate critiques of the Voice of America. I used to like to say in Trump 1, there are kernels of truth here in all of these pieces, right? Not everyone who has concerns over Voice of America's mega. There are potential values to it. So where does the reality sit in terms of Voice of America and its both problems and concerns and the real tension we need to resolve in terms of its value as a strategic asset?
Yeah, I mean, Voice of America, like, I can't even imagine, even if Voice of America had all the possible resources that it wanted, that anyone might want for it, it was always going to be a challenging place to run because it was operating in so many different languages, one. So it's like, frankly, just having quality and oversight, non-corruption, like any of that, and given the number of countries that it was in, the number of languages it was in, I mean, a US-based system run this was going to be hard, just as a beginning. The second is, no matter how hard Voice of America might try to have that credibility of being an independent news organization and being like a fair and accurate, it was always going to be known as a US news agency or a US government agency. And I mean, frankly, more recent administrations, Democratic and Republican, have said, like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, why are we paying for media that is being critical in some cases of US government actions overseas? Why aren't we using this more as like a public diplomacy asset? And like, there's a lot of people that agreed with them and like wanted to try to pursue different ways to influence the coverage there. And then with that, you end up with like a variety of different sort of, not huge, but like really notable vulnerabilities in terms of like the people that they try to cover and the influence in it. There was some staffers in one country that were fired for taking payments from a government official. There were a chief of a service in China was removed for airing an interview with a Chinese dissident that made Beijing really mad. So, like, that was all, like, that sort of editorial standard was always going to be hard. And then, I mean, frankly, like, this is like what any news media environment is having to deal with right now. We're in social media. We have all kinds of independent news across the world. What is Voice of America genuinely adding? I still think that it is adding value, but I think that there is a good question about what is the right way to manage it, even in the kind of media environment that we're in at this moment.
Well, I think that's a lot to chew on in the public and private media space, and obviously something for us to keep watching. But shall we welcome our amazing guest into Warning Signs?
Yes, let's do so.
All right. This week on Warning Signs, we are very excited to have a special guest. I think most of us are thinking about the economy with everything from your own bank account to oil prices. The federal deficit will be nearly 6% of GDP this year, which is really exceptional, especially in a, I guess, quasi-peacetime, depending on what you think is going on with Iran, economy. And that has almost never happened in history. So We are delighted to have Martha Gimbel, who is the executive director and co-founder of the Budget Lab at Yale. She has been doing something that almost no one is doing, which is translating these abstract and crazy economic numbers into what they actually mean for families trying to buy a house or for small businesses trying to keep their businesses afloat. And last week, she sat in front of the Senate subcommittee and laid out a lot of this plainly and with a Hallmark movie analogy to boot. So we are very excited to have you with us, Martha. Welcome to Sirens.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, maybe we could just start with a little bit of a softball question here, but tell us a little bit about the Budget Lab and why we want and need nonpartisan fiscal analysis right now. I mean, I always need it, but why do we as a country need it right now?
I mean, who's amongst us isn't asking for detailed budget tables, the real question. I think there's a couple of things that we were trying to do with Budget Lab. One is be a resource for policymakers and kind of do this rapid response that, helps them make decisions as they're deciding what policy to focus on. The other is, if you think about where we differ from the Congressional Budget Office, which is the official score that we all aspire to, we do two things differently. One is that we look over a longer period of time. So we look over 30 years, not 10 years. And we try to look at benefits, not just costs. CBO looks over the 10-year budget window, and it looks directly at costs. That's what Congress has told them to do. The reason we do that is twofold, right? One is, when you're the government, you're trying to think about things over a really long time period, and really, really long time periods can make things look different. So the One Big Beautiful Bill Act slows down economic growth in the long run because it does so much deficit spending, it raises interest rates. But that doesn't show up really clearly in the 10-year budget window, only shows up over the long run. And then, when you're doing things, the government's usually trying to buy something with what it's doing, right? It's not just spending money to spend money. The way I usually put this, or the example I give is, there are various points right after the invasion of Ukraine where sending arms to Ukraine added 20 basis points onto quarterly annualized GDP in the US. That's not why we did it. We did it because invading other countries is bad and you shouldn't do it. But, in the foreign policy context, I think sometimes policymakers are good about thinking that through, whereas in the domestic policy context, I think sometimes on the benefits, there's a little bit more hand waving.
So maybe that leads us into just talking a little bit about the debt picture. I referenced your testimony, but maybe you could help us think a little bit what's the honest version of what the numbers actually say, and why does it matter? What makes it unsustainable? Sort of how do we think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to say when we talk about unsustainable debt, I like to say probably unsustainable, right? We've hit various points that in the past people would have said oh man, there's going to be consequences here. And we just keep blowing past that. It's a little bit like parents who aren't really holding the line for their toddler. If you go past 80% of debt to GDP, we're going to be really mad. Okay, 90%, 90 and a half, it's real, they're just not holding the line. I think that's made people a little bit too complacent. And so they're thinking because we haven't had anything happen yet, that kind of means nothing will ever happen. And I think the thing that's important to think about here is to break it into two categories. One is, if you think about accumulating debt and rising deficits, what you're doing is just increasing the risk of some kind of crisis. That's not saying it's going to happen, but you are increasing the risk. The other thing is that there are ways in which it does drive up costs for all of us, right? Government spending does something under these circumstances that economists like to call crowd out. Basically, they're offering a lot of money that investors can, put into bonds. That means that they're not going to put it into other types of things. And so you raise interest rates for everyone. So, recent research from us has calculated that if you're taking out a typical mortgage this year, you're paying $2,500 more a year because of the fiscal actions Congress has taken since 2015. And so I want to distinguish between the sort of like slow moving increased costs for American families as opposed to the kind of sudden, scary crisis that I think people often focus on.
Let's actually pull that out a bit, because I found that statistic that you just mentioned, the additional cost of $2,500 a year for a family with a mortgage, like just mind blowing. Like it made it. I don't want to say it made sense in a like I accept it way, but it made sense from a math perspective as you walked through it. But just like to hear it in those stark terms was one, incredibly valuable in terms of the translation, but also shocking. You've done, as Radha mentioned, one of the things that we have admired about how you speak and write about your work is you translate things like national debt, which sounds sort of ephemeral, scary, and you kind of think of it as isolated, like the Treasury building in Washington, D.C., like they'll handle it there, to what it actually means for me in my house, with my family, with my monthly debit statements, and what that looks like for my what I'm planning for my family overall. How does that walk through a little bit more? Like, how does that actually end up in somebody's mortgage payment, as you talked about, and where we may see some disconnects between big meta economy versus my feelings as, I assume, middle-class person who lives in a city right now, or others throughout the country? Like, how do you make that kind of translation?
Yeah. So one thing I should say is if you want to have fun, and I'm putting fun in quotation marks, you can go to our website and like put your exact mortgage in.
It is fun, guys. It's fun.
Yeah,
we'll include the link.
Costing you. It's going to be great. I put my mortgage in and then just became like fully enraged.
Like, we've become revolutionaries on this podcast entirely by accident.
But I think it's also, this is a sort of hidden cost, right? Like when people say we're going to charge you this much in interest, they don't say, like, oh, well, there's been this increase in deficit spending. And because we have more treasuries on the market, that's, crowding out other forms of investment. And so that's driving up interest rates for everyone. And so that's not how people talk about it. They say, this is your rate. And then you think, man, I wish my rate were lower. And they go, well, that seems like a problem for you. Sign here or don't. And so I think it's really hard for people because they have this kind of sense that interest rates are high. But they don't have a breakdown of like how much of this is because of remaining inflation, how much of this is because of, structural changes, how much of this is because of deficit spending. And I want to be clear, like deficit spending is not the only reason that interest rates are higher. Like, let's just be very explicit about that. But it does make a difference. And so I think it's hard for people when there's just kind of this like nebulous sense of like, it used to be different. Why is it like this now? I guess we're just kind of stuck. And that's kind of what we're trying to break through a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this in another one of my favorite interviews with our friend, Catherine Edwards, on this sort of slow moving crisis of unaffordability and inequality. And maybe you can help us think through in this context, how do things like the debt or things like higher interest rate connect to that sort of slow, I'll call it a slow moving problem. I feel like crisis, to your point, feels like an acute point in time. And this feels like an accumulating burden. But what is that? How do those connect? And like, what does a U.S. fiscal big problem instead of a crisis actually look like? Are we in one now? Nobody told us? Or like, what would that look like?
Oh, I like that. Big problem. Like, I'm going to steal that, actually. I love that. I think people have this sense that things aren't as, it sounds dismissive to say easy as they want them to be, but I don't mean that in a dismissive way. But, like if you look at housing affordability, there's various ways to look at this, but by some measures, we're back where we were in the 1980s, which is frustrating to people. I should say, I'm going to lose my economist card here if I don't specify that, wages adjusted for inflation have been growing, like living standards are higher, all of these things. And so I think there's a couple of things that are going on here. One has been, we have had a lot of inflation and we have higher interest rates than people are used to. And so things just cost more than we think they should, right? Like, I'm still mad about how much more coffee costs than it did 5 years ago. I'm not going to get over that for a little bit. The other aspect of it is that certain parts of the consumption bundle, as economists would say, this is why people love economists, are more emotional for people, right? So, the price for children's clothes has been going over time. It is cheaper for me to dress my toddler than it was for my mother to dress me. And that's great. And my toddler benefits from that, and I benefit from that. Daycare is much more expensive. And as much as I love putting my toddler in like really cute shoes, daycare is much more emotional for me than the shoes are. And I think one thing that we don't think about sometimes is when we talk about, real earnings, and how they have grown, is yes, people are better off than they were 20, 30, certainly 100 years ago. But there are parts of the consumption bundle that are really emotional for people, like housing, like childcare, like health insurance, where even if other costs are going down to make up for that increase, it still feels really bad to people because they really, really care about those.
Building on this emotional point that you're making, which I think is so important, and I'll just have a brief aside of like where this really struck me on the coffee thing. There used to be, and there still are, these little convenience stores inside the Pentagon, in addition to all the other like Starbucks and things like that. But like the convenience store would also sell like the crappy 7-Eleven coffee, basically. And for the longest time, it was always like $1 or $1.50. Like that, it was just it. There was no inflation to these. It was just that cost. And I went in recently, and then it increased to like some odd number of like $1.72. Like, whoa, what? I have to make change for this? Like, this is insane. What's happening here? And cost of living increase. But if listeners of Sirens know that Radha and I love hates to talk about tariffs, and one of our favorite acronyms to say out loud is IEPA. Budget Lab has been a fantastic source on tariff costs and impacts. And we talked about a while back when SCOTUS struck down IEPA, again, amazing acronym, where you did an amazing segment on this, kind of talking through this topic around a big box store. I'd love to better understand, like, now that that's happened, who is still hurting? Was relief possible at some point in time? And like, how are we seeing both the slowing down of that, but then also the ongoing 15% tariffs still impact families on the day to day?
So one thing I want to put actually is you just said 15% tariffs. And that is technically incorrect because the president has said we're moving to 15%. Secretary Bessent has said that they're issuing something saying that's going to be 15%, and they still haven't done it. And so technically we're still at 10%. And like, and I bring this up not to be like, gotcha, but like, this is exactly part of the problem, right? It's like, people really don't know what the tariff rate is, even if you're very, very well informed. And so it's creating a huge amount of uncertainty. We got a bunch of questions after IEPA saying like, oh, does this mean that costs are going to go down for families now? Well, no. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? One is we know from past research that the price increases due to tariffs tend to be relatively asymmetrical. So if you put a tariff on, companies will eventually raise prices in response to that. And then when the tariff comes off, they don't tend to lower the price, right? The consumer has proved that they will pay the price, so they are going to continue to charge the price. The other aspect of it is like, sure, IEPA came off, but they immediately put new tariffs back on that weren't quite as large, but were still pretty big. They've been very explicit that they're going to do, tariffs under new legal authorities moving forward. Why would you adjust your pricing? You have no idea what's going to go on. You're just going to annoy consumers if you're like, toys are 10% less. Now they're 20% more. Oh, wait, no, never mind. We're going down. No, you're going to pick a level that you think is sustainable and stick with it until you have some certainty here. And so, I think there was a lot of rejoicing when the IEPA ruling came down. And to be clear, I think there's questions about that from like a rule of law standpoint. But from an economic standpoint, the only thing it did was inject more uncertainty into the tariff conversation, because now businesses don't know where the administration is going to end up.
I remember post, I guess it was Liberation Day or whatever it was in the first rounds, like major tariffs are announced. And the people, like the next week, I think President Trump had made some allusion to like, and billions of dollars are rolling in. And as it turns out, none of the tariffs are being collected because it's not just like a spreadsheet and you just like hit send and suddenly like, okay, it's happening. Like there's entire elements of state capacity, both legal authority, but also state capacity, but also have to be ready to adapt to this. And like all kinds of things in terms of like where you are in the transaction process. It is not an immediate overnight thing. So I love your point on that. Like, actually, no, it's still 10. Fascinating and mind-blowing.
I had a reporter at some point in 2025 call me and ask me what the tariff rate was like on an incredibly specific product. And I said, I have no idea, right? Like I think about the macro, but you should call CBP and I'm sure that they can, help out here. And he said, I did. I called them right before I called you and they have no idea, right? And it's like, of course they don't, right? Like it's up, it's down, it's left, it's right, And they, a lot of this capacity really wasn't there because they weren't used to calculating it. I remember really vividly when I was in college, I'd been studying abroad in Italy and I came back. This is relevant, I promise. And I came back and I had really taken advantage of being in Italy and I was bringing back more stuff than you could get through on the like small exemption. And I walked up to the customs officer and I said, like, my good sir, I have the receipts and I am reporting like as a good American citizen that I have to pay. And the guy looked at me and said, you don't tell us you don't have to pay. And I said, but I have to pay. It's the law. And we did this for like 15 minutes before he just gave up. And then I was there for an hour because they were like going through these old books. Like they never dealt with it. They had no idea. And so, per your point on like a state capacity standpoint, when you reorient all these things really, really quickly, it takes time. And you've seen this a little bit in the conversation about paying out refunds, where the administration's been saying to judges, like, look, we'll figure this out, we promise, but like literally the computers aren't set up for this. Like we don't know what we're doing.
And I mean, maybe on that time point, I think the initial argument on tariffs, at least in part, was premised on this idea of bringing home a combination of getting revenue, which we're talking about here, and bringing in manufacturing jobs. So presumably those types of jobs would kind of help counterbalance some of what we're seeing on the economic story, or?
So Budget Lab does have like a state of tariffs impact tracker. None of this is perfect, right? You can't say what would happen absent other things, but you really have not seen the manufacturing renaissance that the administration was talking about. In fact, we've lost jobs since Liberation Day. So, it's tariffs, I think, are something that just seem really appealing to people. And the economic evidence is really clear. They don't create jobs, they raise costs, and they lower economic output. And as fun as they seem, like it seems really fun to have other people giving us, tax revenue, but it really just gets passed on to Americans and we end up paying it. And it's a really inefficient tax. And so the benefits that were promised have not come through, and it's highly unlikely they ever will.
So maybe I will try to wrap us on an optimistic note, which is, I like to do this. It sometimes goes very, very wrong. But is there a version where we get our fiscal house in order, that things look better, that we're on the right, I'll call it trajectory? Maybe it's not all fixed, but the derivative is right. What would that actually take and look like, do you think?
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that currently there's no real political benefit to policymakers of taking a strong stance here. I do maintain that there is some political cost that they pay for deficit spending, because at this point that's flowing through to inflation or interest rates, and that they do pay for that at the ballot box. But that's also very disconnected for them, right? Like, it's not in their heads. And when they get calls from constituents, they're not saying, man, my mortgage is too high because of the crowding out that you all are doing due to deficit spending. You got to deal with this. They're saying, like, fix housing affordability, write checks. Like, it's fun to write a check. I too would love to write checks for free money. And so, I do think at this point, it's really a political problem. I hate to say to the listeners that you are the problem, but listeners, you are the problem. And if you decide this isn't a problem and start calling your policymakers, then things will change.
Well, perfect. Listeners, take up the mantle and fix the U.S. economy, please. Report back. Martha, thank you for joining us. This was fun and interesting, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's talk Oscars, which shockingly, I actually watched a significant part of this year, which is a rare thing for me. I'm not totally certain that I'm actually trying to remember if I saw any of the movies. I'm
K-pop Demon Hunters.
Yes, I did see K-pop Demon Hunters. I definitely saw K-pop Demon Hunters. I am aware of a number of the movies. Let's see. But let's talk fashion for a second. Like, which dresses did you love the most?
Okay, this has nothing to do with loving it, but the controversy over Gwyneth Paltrow's dress has been like out of control.
Tell me more.
Like, what should 50-year-old women wear? Because she consciously
oh gosh, yes, we had the
sleeper
on the side.
That's right. So she would have like a sheer sparkly material in the middle and the front panel and the back panel. And there was allegations of a wardrobe mishap. I don't know what happened. Look, the lady looks good. If she wants to wear a dress where the front and back aren't attached, or attached with sheer fabric, you do you. It sounds uncomfortable. I'm not going to lie.
Her face did seem like a little frozen. Maybe she was just nervous, though. Hard to say. I really liked Jessie Buckley's dress, which was basically kind of a crimson thing on top and then pink skirt on the bottom. Like, there was a whole lot of pink and a whole lot of white. I felt like I was watching like kind of a princess sort of movie for a while.
I also, I don't want to go too far down the controversial various woke and DEI tracks, but I will note, in a time where the political landscape is complex, it was great to see like K-pop Demon Hunters and K-pop really getting there. Mm-hmm. Michael B. Jordan getting his and call outs to the Black actors of the past who got awards. And then Jessie, what's her name? Jessie
Buckley.
Jessie Buckley, her speech ending with how did she put it? Like, the chaotic beauty of a mother's heart. Like, the whole thing. It was a real feel-good Oscars, I felt.
Yeah. She also, I think she spoke Gaelic at the end, too. Yes, I enjoyed all those things. I also loved the Sinners music, the dance, and like the whole that was awesome, particularly the ballet. When they brought in the big old FU to Timothée Chalamet of like, hey, I know you don't really like opera or ballet and you don't think these are valuable, so we're just gonna like put this directly in your face. That was sort of a lovely moment for me.
Comeuppance.
Yes, a good comeuppance. Missy Copeland, I lost her name for a minute. I'm going to confess something about one of the movie previews that they were showing, because how they show for all of the Best Picture ones, they show all the 5-minute or so or less than that clip. And during the middle of one for Sinners, I kept looking at it thinking, well, that's Michael B. Jordan. And that other guy looks so much like Michael B. Jordan too. Who is that? This is so crazy. Why can't I figure out who it is? And then I realized, I haven't seen the movie, obviously, that he was playing twins, which made it all the more impressive.
He was.
Yeah. I have confirmed that other than K-pop Demon Hunters, I have not actually seen any of these. I've read the book Hamnet. I've read Frankenstein. You know, that's totally close.
Look,
to like,
you're not going to get judgment from me for not watching.
No, I know. Like, I might see some of these at some point in time.
I will not. So I'll give you that. You'll still have seen more Oscar movies that came out this year than I have over the course of our lives, Lauren.
That is almost certainly true. Next year, if they could just have like an entirely like Pride and Prejudice, various forms of Pride and Prejudice get nominated for the Oscars. See which one.
I mean, there could be a range. I could take Hallmark movie. Where are the Hallmark movie Oscars?
When The Devil Wears Prada sweeps next year,
yeah,
we will.
I'll be ready. I will have seen it. That's right. That's true. We'll look forward to that.
Though, thank you for listening to another delightful episode of Sirens with all of the romantic comedy or bad boyfriends and analogies that you might wish. And we will see you next time.
Thank you.